The autumn wind had a particular kind of cruelty that morning. Not the sharp, biting cold that announces winter, but the slow, creeping chill that settles into old bones and reminds you that everything warm eventually fades. I was sitting on a wooden bench in the courtyard of Maplewood Veterans Retreat, watching dead leaves skitter across the concrete like they were running from something. Maybe they were. I had been running from something too, only I had stopped running 2 months ago and checked myself in here instead. My name is Jack Calloway, 71 years old, retired military intelligence, 30 years of service that took me to places I still cannot name and showed me things I will never forget. I checked myself into this facility after my wife, Eleanor, passed away without warning on a Tuesday morning in March. One moment, she was pouring coffee. The next moment, she was gone. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever experienced in my life, and I have stood in the middle of active combat zones. The doctors told me the quiet would help me heal. Instead, the quiet only sharpened my mind into something dangerous. I spent my days cataloging the behavioral patterns of the orderlies, memorizing the medication schedules, and keeping my investigative instincts alive the way a soldier keeps a blade cleaned, oiled, and ready even when there is no visible enemy. There is always an enemy. You just have to be patient enough to wait for them to show themselves. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. Because what happened to my family over the next several days is something that every single person who has ever loved someone needs to hear. I saw my brother Thomas walking up the main path before the security receptionist had even buzzed him through the secondary gate. We share the exact same face, Thomas and I. The same broad forehead, the same gray temples, the same 71 years carved into the lines around our eyes. We are identical in every physical detail, a fact that had fascinated our mother and confused our teachers, and would, in just a few short hours, become the most important tactical advantage I had ever possessed. But Thomas was not walking the way I walked. He never had. Where I moved with the unconscious precision of a man trained to occupy space deliberately, Thomas moved like water, finding the path of least resistance. He was an accountant by trade and by temperament, a gentle man who built his entire life around spreadsheets, quiet evenings, and a deep, abiding love for his daughter. He trusted numbers because numbers never lied to him and never raised their voices and never shoved him down a flight of stairs. Today, my brother looked like he had been shattered and poorly reassembled. He was hunched so deeply into himself that his shoulders nearly touched his ears. He wore thick, dark sunglasses despite the heavy, overcast sky pressing down on the world like a gray wool blanket. His hands, clasped together in his lap as he sat down heavily on the bench beside me, were trembling. His knuckles had gone completely white against the familiar gray fabric of the cardigan I had given him 3 Christmases ago. He tried to smile. The attempt was heartbreaking. It was the smile of a man who had forgotten what smiling felt like, but was performing it anyway out of a lifetime habit of not wanting to worry anyone. He told me he was just passing through the area. He said he wanted to check in on my grief counseling and see how I was managing. His voice was tight and controlled in the way that voices become when they're working very hard to hold something enormous at bay. I did not say a word about his lie. I looked at the dark lenses covering his eyes, and something cold and familiar settled into my chest. I had felt that particular coldness before, in interrogation rooms, in hostile territories, in moments just before everything changed. I reached out and pulled the sunglasses from his face before he could stop me. He flinched so violently that he nearly fell off the bench. His arms flew up in a defensive posture that no man learns from tripping over a loose rug. The entire left side of his face was a landscape of violence. Purple and deep yellow bruising covered his cheekbone like a storm system moving across a pale sky. A laceration cut through the swelling, held together by 3 cheap butterfly bandages that someone had applied in a hurry. His left eye was forced halfway shut by the swelling surrounding it. And then my brother began to explain that he had fallen down the basement stairs. He spoke quickly, filling the air with words the way a man throws sand into a fire, hoping to smother something he is terrified of. He described a loose rug and a wet banister in a moment of terrible clumsiness, and his voice shook with every syllable. And I sat beside him, and I listened to every single word of his fabricated story, and I felt something in my chest that I had not felt since Eleanor died. I felt completely, terrifyingly awake. I leaned forward and looked at him with the eyes I had spent 30 years training. I told him the angle of the bruising was entirely wrong for a downward fall. I pointed to the defensive marks on his forearms, the faint finger-shaped shadows darkening his wrists. I told him he was lying to the only person on earth who could read him the way he read his own ledger books, down to the last decimal point. I told him to give me a name. Thomas broke. Not gradually, not politely, but completely and all at once. The way a dam does not leak before it fails, it simply holds and holds and holds, and then it does not hold anymore. He buried his face in his trembling hands and wept with his entire body, his shoulders heaving, his breath coming in jagged, drowning gasps, the sound of a man releasing 6 months of accumulated terror in a single, sitting on a wooden bench in a courtyard full of dead leaves. I did not reach for him. I did not offer hollow words. I simply sat with him and waited, because the truth always finds its way out when you give it enough silence to move through. When he finally caught his breath and lifted his ravaged face from his hands, the story that spilled out into the cold autumn air was worse than anything I had imagined. His son-in-law, a man named Derek Hartwell. Derek had married Thomas's daughter, Vivian, for years ago in a ceremony that cost my brother $60,000 and produced, as far as I could tell, precisely nothing of value. Derek operated a mid-sized logistics company that had been quietly drowning in debt for the better part of 18 months. The company was hemorrhaging money from every seam, and Derek, rather than confronting the reality of his own failures, had identified a solution: my brother's retirement portfolio. Nearly $2 million, accumulated over 40 years of careful, disciplined, unglamorous work. Derek had begun asking for access to the funds 6 months ago. When Thomas hesitated, citing his medical expenses and the comfortable retirement he had promised himself and Eleanor, the asking became demanding. When the demand produced no results, it became something else entirely. 3 nights before Thomas appeared on my bench with broken butterfly bandages on his face, Derek had cornered him at the top of the basement stairs. He demanded the signature one more time. Thomas said no, and Derek shoved him. 12 wooden steps, concrete floor at the bottom, a fractured cheekbone, 2 cracked ribs. I asked Thomas where Vivian had been when this happened. He looked at the ground for a long time. The leaves skittered past us. He told me Vivian had been standing in the kitchen. She had seen everything. She had not called an ambulance. She had not screamed at her husband. She had turned around and walked upstairs, and Thomas had lain on the cold basement floor, bleeding and broken, listening to her footsteps move away from him. That night, Derek stood over Thomas's bed and delivered his ultimatum: sign the asset transfer documents by the end of the week, or Derek would pursue a legal declaration of mental incompetence and have Thomas permanently committed to a state-run psychiatric facility. Vivian had already agreed to sign the medical affidavits. She had already agreed to describe her father as a man suffering from violent dementia. My brother had come to my facility to say goodbye to me. He believed his life was over. He believed his own daughter had decided his $2 million was worth more than his freedom, his dignity, and his safety. I stood up from the wooden bench. The grief I had come here to process was still somewhere inside me, but right now I could not reach it. What I could reach was something else entirely. Something cold and precise and absolutely certain. I grabbed my brother's arm and told him to stand up. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and said my name like a question. I told him we needed to find a bathroom, because what I was about to do required a very specific kind of preparation. And Derek Hartwell had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. Stay with me, because this story is only just beginning, and what happens in the next 24 hours is something neither Derek nor Vivian will ever recover from. Not as long as they live. The visitor center bathroom smelled like institutional soap and fluorescent lighting. I locked the heavy door behind us and turned to face my brother, who who stood in the middle of the small room, looking like a man trying to understand a language he had never studied. I told him to take off his clothes. He stared at me. I told him again, calmly, clearly, the way I had given orders in places far more chaotic than a veterans facility restroom. I explained what I was going to do. I explained that he was not going back to that house. He was going to stay here in my room, under my name, sealed behind medical privacy protocols that not even a team of lawyers with a signed court order could immediately penetrate. Dr. Marcus Vance, the chief resident of the facility and a former colleague from my military years, would handle everything. A 2-week medical isolation period for severe grief management. No visitors. No phone calls. Thomas Calloway would simply cease to exist for the outside world. And Jack Calloway would walk out the front gate wearing a gray wool cardigan and a cheap pair of reading glasses and drive directly into the mouth of the beast. Thomas started to argue. He said Derek would send the police. He said the police would come to the facility and demand to see him, and the whole plan would collapse. I looked at him and said, very quietly, that Derek was not going to look for him. Derek was going to find me. And by the time Derek understood the difference, it would be much too late to matter. We traded everything. His cardigan for my jacket, his tailored slacks for my military trousers, his comfortable walking shoes for my heavy boots. I took his wallet, his car keys, his house keys, and the cheap reading glasses from his shirt pocket. I stood before the cracked mirror above the sink and adjusted the glasses on my nose and practiced the particular deflation of my brother's posture, the way his shoulders curved inward, the way his chin dropped, the way his eyes moved away from confrontation, the way water moves away from heat. I had studied Thomas Calloway my entire life. I knew his body language better than he did. I gave him his instructions. Go to my room. Lock the door. Dr. Vance will come to you. Speak to no one. Trust no one except Vance. Do not call me. Do not try to follow events. Simply be safe. Simply breathe. He grabbed my arm before I reached the door. His grip was stronger than I expected. He looked at me with eyes that were full of something that made my chest ache deeply, a complicated mixture of terror and desperate hope, and 67 years of brotherhood compressed into a single moment. He said my name. I covered his hand with mine for exactly 3 seconds. Then I gently removed it. I walked out of the bathroom, past the reception desk, through the front gates, and into the car park. Thomas's sedan sat near the back row, a sensible dark blue vehicle that smelled of old coffee and the particular sadness of a man who drives alone to places he used to drive to with someone he loved. I started the engine. I adjusted the mirrors. I drove toward the wealthy suburbs, and I did not look back. The drive took 45 minutes. The neighborhood I entered was the kind that announces its own wealth quietly, but insistently, the way certain people do. Wide, clean streets. Established trees with leaves the color of old gold. Driveways that curved in gentle arcs toward houses built to be admired. Every single property on that street was a monument to money that had been either earned over generations or stolen over years. I knew which category Derek Hartwell fell into. I pulled into the sweeping, circular driveway of the brick estate before I had even put the car in park. The heavy front door flew open. He came out like a man who had been sitting at a window all day, vibrating with the specific impatience of someone who believes the world runs on his schedule. Derek Hartwell was a large man. Not naturally large, but the kind of large that is purchased through expensive gym memberships and supplemented by the particular arrogance of a man who uses his physical size as his primary argument. He was wearing a designer polo shirt stretched tight across his shoulders, and his face was already flushing crimson as he descended the front steps with the barely contained energy of someone who had been waiting to explode. He reached the car before I had finished turning off the ignition. He grabbed the door handle and ripped it open. He reached inside and grabbed a fistful of gray wool cardigan and hauled me out of the seat with one sharp, violent motion, slamming my back against the side of the car hard enough to make my teeth click together. He put his face very close to mine. His breath smelled of stale coffee and the sourness of a man who had been feeding on his own anxiety all day. He demanded to know where I had been. He told me the papers should have been signed this morning. He told me he was done, completely done, waiting for a useless old man to do the single useful thing he had been asked to do. I let my head drop. I let my shoulders fold. I let my hands shake against the cold metal of the car door. I made myself small in the way Thomas had spent 6 months being small, and I watched Derek's face from beneath my lowered eyelids with the calm, recording precision of a military surveillance operator. I told him there had been a complication at the bank. My voice came out thin and cracked and breathless, exactly as I intended. He tightened his grip and lifted me slightly off the ground and asked what kind of complication. I explained, in a small and faltering voice, that because the portfolio exceeded $1 million, the bank manager had refused to release the funds on a simple signature alone. They required a formal in-person appearance tomorrow morning with a certified notary to legally finalize the transfer. The lie was clean and specific and designed to purchase exactly 24 hours. Derek released me with a shove that sent me stumbling against the car door, and he spat on the ground near my feet, and he pointed at my face and told me that if the money was not in his account by noon the following day, he would throw me down those stairs again. He told me this time he would make sure I did not wake up. Then he turned and walked back into the house, leaving the front door open behind him. I straightened very slowly. I brushed the dirt from my borrowed trousers. I walked through the front door and closed it quietly behind me. And I stood in the foyer of the beautiful house that my brother had paid for and looked at the imported crystal chandelier throwing fractured light across the Brazilian hardwood floor. Every luxury in this house had been purchased with stolen time. I descended the wooden stairs into the basement with careful deliberateness, placing my weight on the outer edges of each step to silence the wood. At the bottom, I found a room where Thomas had lived for 6 months. It was a concrete box, a rusted cot with a thin mattress, a cracked mirror above a small utility sink, a dusty nightstand with a digital clock. The ceiling was a map of exposed copper pipes. The walls retained cold the way stone retains cold, indifferent and absolute. My brother had woken up every morning for 6 months in this room and climbed those stairs and sat at that gleaming mahogany table and endured the casual contempt of a man who viewed him as nothing more than a financial instrument. I sat on the edge of the cot and felt the springs protest beneath me, and I stared at the ceiling and I waited. I want to pause here for just a moment because I know some of you are already feeling what I felt sitting on that cot. That particular mixture of grief and fury that comes when someone you love has been reduced to a thing by people who were supposed to protect them. If this story is reaching something inside you, please hit like. Please share it. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know how far Thomas's story travels tonight. At 2 in the morning, when the house above me had been silent for over an hour, I moved. I crept up the stairs with the quiet precision I had spent 30 years perfecting in classified locations I cannot name. I ghosted through the kitchen, avoiding the moonlight falling through the bay windows, and navigated the long hallway to Derek's private home office. The lock took 4 seconds. I have broken locks in active combat zones with noise restrictions and enemy sentries within earshot. A residential brass deadbolt in a wealthy suburb is not a challenge. It is barely a formality. The office was dark and thick with the particular atmosphere of a man who mistakes expensive furniture for significance. Mahogany desk, imported leather chairs, framed photographs of Derek shaking hands with local politicians, each one radiating the hollow confidence of a man performing power he did not actually possess. I woke the computer. The password prompt glowed blue in the darkness. I thought about Derek Hartwell for a moment. I thought about the specific architecture of his ego, the particular brand of arrogance that allows a man to steal from his own employees and assault his elderly father-in-law and sleep soundly in an expensive bed afterward. Men like Derek do not choose secure passwords. They choose reflections of themselves. I typed his company name followed by the year he founded it and an exclamation mark. The system rejected it. I paused. I adjusted my assessment. I typed his own first name, the word boss, and the number 1. The desktop materialized instantly. I opened his financial folders, expecting the desperate, disorganized ledgers of a failing business. What I found was something far more organized and far more criminal. Derek was running 2 completely separate sets of financial books. The official record showed his logistics company hemorrhaging money, reporting massive losses to the federal government, paying essentially nothing in corporate taxes. The hidden ledger told the true story. He was systematically draining his own company's revenue into offshore shell accounts using phantom shipments and fictitious vendor invoices. He was stealing directly from the government, starving his own business, and using Thomas's retirement fund as a temporary bandage to keep the auditors from looking too closely. And then I found the subfolder marked with Vivian's initials. Property deeds, vehicle registrations, high-yield private investment portfolios. Every single asset legally registered in her name alone. Derek was not just a criminal. He was a careful one. He was building a financial fortress behind his wife's clean legal identity, funneling stolen, untaxed money into her personal holdings so that when the auditors eventually came knocking, he could stand behind her assets like a coward hiding behind a human shield. I sat very still in the darkness of that office for a long moment, because I had come here to protect my brother's money. But what I had just found was something that required a different kind of response entirely. I plugged my encrypted flash drive into the computer tower. The progress bar began its slow crawl across the screen. I watched it move toward completion while the house breathed around me in the darkness. At 99%, the floorboard in the hallway outside the door groaned under a heavy footstep. Someone was awake. I watched the progress bar inch toward 100 as the footsteps grew louder, slower, more deliberate, moving directly toward the closed office door. I kept my breathing even. I kept my hand steady over the eject button. The screen flashed its completion notification. I pulled the drive, pocketed it, killed the monitor, and pressed myself against the wall beside the door as the brass handle began to turn. Whether you continue to the next part of this story will tell me everything I need to know about whether justice still means something to you. Because in part 3, I sit across a kitchen island from a woman who watched her father bleed on a concrete floor, and what she says to me will break your heart and harden it at exactly the same time. Morning came through the basement ceiling in vibrations. The central heating system is humming. The distant shuffle of feet on expensive hardwood. The particular quality of silence that exists in a house where the people inside it believe they are winning. I stood before the cracked mirror in the basement and looked at my reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. I adjusted the reading glasses. I practiced the slump. I traced the edge of the butterfly bandages on my cheekbone, where Thomas's bruising had deepened overnight into a color that had no business existing on a human face. I took a slow breath and tucked Jack Calloway away behind the frightened eyes of his twin brother. Then I climbed the stairs to meet my niece. Vivian Hartwell was standing in the kitchen in a silk robe that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent, holding a ceramic mug with both hands and staring at something on her phone with the particular vacancy of a person who has perfected the art of being present only when it benefits her. She did not look up when I entered. She did not say good morning. She did not ask about the bruising on my face or the cracked ribs beneath my cardigan or the 6 months I had spent sleeping on a cot in her basement. She reached over to the toaster without looking at me, dropped 2 pieces of plain bread into it, waited for them to pop up, and slid the plate across the cold marble island in my direction. The toast was unbuttered. It had already gone cold. I pulled out a heavy wooden stool and sat down and stared at the plate. I needed to understand the depth of her. I needed to look into the eyes of this woman my brother had raised and sacrificed for and adored, and determine whether there was anything left inside her worth saving, or whether she had traded it all away voluntarily and without regret. I raised one trembling hand and pressed my fingertips gently against the swollen bruising around my eye. I let the pain move through my face in a visible wince, quiet and unguarded, the sound of a man who has stopped trying to hide how much he hurts. I looked up at her. I called her by the name Thomas, always used when he was trying to reach her. I asked her about the stairs. I kept my voice soft and fractured, barely above a whisper, just loud enough to carry across the hum of the refrigerator. I asked her why she walked away. I asked her why, when her husband shoved her father, she turned her back and went upstairs. I asked her how she slept in her beautiful bed, knowing I was broken on the concrete floor beneath her. I gave her everything. I laid the entire landscape of her father's suffering at her feet, and I waited for her to step into it, to let it touch her, to prove to me that somewhere beneath the silk robe and the expensive espresso and the moral vacancy of the past 6 months, Thomas's daughter still existed. Vivian took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She set the mug down on the marble with a small, sharp click. She looked at me with an expression so completely devoid of anything warm or anguished or human that it took my breath away. Not because I hadn't seen that expression before, but because I had never expected to see it on the face of someone my brother had loved so completely. She told me I was overreacting. She told me I had always been too sensitive. She told me I needed to stop playing the victim. Her voice was perfectly even, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed her indifference so many times that it had become completely natural to her. She said Derek was under tremendous corporate pressure and that I was intentionally making things worse by being stubborn about the portfolio. She said it was my own fault that things had escalated. She was blaming the broken ribs on the man who had them. She leaned forward and placed her hands flat on the cold marble and told me to stop being dramatic. She said the money was just sitting in a retirement account, doing nothing while they were trying to maintain their responsibilities and keep their lives intact. She told me to go to the bank that morning, sign the transfer documents without any further complaints, and hand the portfolio to Derek. She said it was the only way to restore peace in her household. And then she said the words that severed everything. She told me that if I just did what I was told, nobody would have to get hurt anymore. The silence that followed those words was the kind of silence that has weight. I sat with it. I let it settle over everything in that bright, cold, marble kitchen, over the untouched plate of cold toast and the expensive espresso machine and the silk robe and the absence of any mercy whatsoever in my niece's eyes. I thought about Thomas on that bench, his trembling hands, his ruined face, the way he wept not like a sad man, but like a completely demolished one. I thought about the 6 months he had spent in that basement, climbing those stairs every morning to face people who saw him as a financial inconvenience dressed in a human body. I thought about the cold toast, and I understood that Vivian had made her choice a long time ago, and she had made it freely, and she had made it every single day for 6 months, one small moral surrender at a time, until the woman Thomas had raised had been entirely replaced by someone who could watch her father bleed on the floor and walk away without a backward glance. I lowered my head. I let a single tear track down my uninjured cheek. I nodded slowly and whispered that I understood, that I would go to the bank, that I was sorry for causing trouble. Vivian let out a breath of relief, so heavy and satisfied that it turned my stomach. She turned her back to me to pour another cup of coffee, utterly certain that she had just bullied a broken old man into complete submission. I picked up the cold toast and took a slow, deliberate bite. Vivian Hartwell had just signed her own financial obituary. She simply did not know it yet. I need you to stay with me here, because I know exactly what you are feeling right now. That particular kind of ache you get when someone who was supposed to love unconditionally turns out to have never understood what the word meant. If this story is sitting heavy in your chest, you are not alone. Hit like. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And keep going, because what happens next is the part where justice stops being a concept and starts being real. That night, when the house was dark and Derek had returned from wherever angry, desperate men go when their stolen money stopped moving. I sat at the dining room table and ate the expensive steakhouse dinner Vivian had ordered on a credit card I already knew was days away from being permanently worthless. I cut my ribeye with measured, deliberate movements. I chewed it slowly. I tasted every bite. When Derek stormed in like a man whose entire world was on fire and stood over me screaming that the card had been declined in front of his investors, that the bank had locked him out of everything, that I had ruined his life with my stubbornness, I simply kept eating. I cut another piece of steak. He hurled a crystal water glass at the wall. It shattered with a sound like a small explosion. Vivian screamed and covered her face. I did not blink. I picked up my linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth. And then I set down my utensils, and I looked at Derek Hartwell with a fraction of my actual self bleeding through the disguise, just enough for him to feel something cold move through him without understanding why. And I told him, in a voice barely above a whisper, the legal reality of the ground he was standing on. He was not going to evict me. He was not going to drag me anywhere. The deed to this estate had been transferred into an irrevocable protected trust 5 years ago, with a permanent life estate residency clause in my favor. He and Vivian were legally classified as permitted guests. If he wanted me removed, he would need to file a contested civil petition that would take 6 months to process. If he touched me, it would be classified as felony elder assault, and the police would be at the door within minutes. He was trapped in this house with me, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to change that. The crystal shards on the floor caught the light. Derek's jaw worked silently. His fist clenched and released and clenched again, and the rage in his eyes slowly curdled into something that looked almost like fear. I picked up my knife and fork again and finished my dinner. But the real work of that night had already been done. Because while Derek had been throwing crystal at walls and Vivian had been pretending the world was not collapsing around her expensive shoes, I had spent the early hours of the morning building the legal apparatus of their total destruction. In a 24-hour diner on the edge of the city, a man named Carter Simmons was waiting for me with a cup of black coffee and a silver laptop and 30 years of legal devastation at his fingertips. What we built together that night over bitter coffee and Formica tables was not just a defense for Thomas. It was a guillotine, and part 4 is where we let it drop. Carter Simmons did not look like a weapon. He was a compact man in a sharp black suit, with careful eyes that missed nothing and an absolute economy of movement that you only develop when you have spent years in situations where unnecessary motion could cost lives. 30 years ago, he had been a young intelligence officer under my direct command during a deployment I am still legally prevented from describing in detail. I had pulled him from a burning transport vehicle with hostile fire coming from 3 directions. He had gone on to become the most methodical corporate litigator in the state. He owed me his life. He repaid that debt every time I called. I placed the encrypted flash drive on the Formica table between us. I told him what was on it. The dual ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, the phantom invoices, the shell accounts registered exclusively in Vivian's name, and in a separate folder, photographed with a small digital camera in the small hours of the morning in a master bedroom while the monsters slept above me, the contents of a hidden floor safe that I had opened using 40 years of accumulated knowledge and 4 minutes of absolute silence. Carter picked up the drive and turned it slowly in his fingers. A cold smile moved across the corners of his mouth and did not reach his eyes. He told me tax fraud was devastating but manageable for a first-time white-collar offender. Expensive lawyers, negotiated settlements, perhaps a suspended sentence. Ruinous but survivable. I told him to open the secondary folder. I told him about the pension funds. The smile disappeared completely. Carter understood immediately what I understood, that a jury will extend limited sympathy to a man who steals from the government. But a man who steals the retirement savings of his own truck drivers, his own warehouse workers, the men and women who drove through winter storms and unloaded pallets in freezing pre-dawn warehouses so his company could function, that man will find no mercy in any courtroom in the country. He will find only the particular fury of people who recognize themselves in his victims. Carter opened his laptop. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the focused velocity of a man building something that cannot be undone. His strategy was a synchronized total strike. He would not give them time to communicate, to coordinate legal defenses, to move hidden assets. Everything would happen simultaneously, from every direction, in the span of a single morning. First, the tax fraud evidence, submitted directly to a specialized federal contact in the Criminal Investigations Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Guaranteed immediate account freeze across every financial instrument bearing either Derek's or Vivian's Social Security number. Second, the pension ledgers, delivered by secure federal courier to the State Labor Board with a formal request for emergency injunction. The physical evidence of stolen employee retirement funds would prompt an unannounced raid on the logistics company headquarters and on the private estate itself. Third, the documentation of Vivian's $82,000 in unsecured luxury debt would be forwarded anonymously to her premium credit card companies, triggering immediate hostile collections and asset repossession. And woven through all of it, the irrevocable blind trust that Carter had already finalized for Thomas's $2 million. Henry would receive a comfortable monthly stipend for the rest of his life. His medical care and housing would be permanently secured, and the principal balance would be legally untouchable by anyone, including Thomas himself. Even with a gun to his head, Thomas literally could not authorize a transfer. The money was behind walls that no civil attorney could breach. Carter closed the laptop with a quiet, final click. He said the dominoes were in motion. By 9 the following morning, Derek Hartwell would be a man without a company, without a bank account, without a future, and without a lawyer willing to sit beside him in the same room. I finished my coffee and walked out into the cold night air and drove back to the brick estate and slept, or was something close to sleeping, on the rustic cot in the basement, listening to the house breathe around me and thinking about Thomas, about what it had cost him to survive 6 months in that room, about what it was going to cost Derek and Vivian when they discovered that the old man in the gray cardigan had not been what they thought he was. At 9 in the morning, Derek's corporate lawyer arrived with a leather briefcase and a pinstripe suit and the predatory smile of a man who charges by the hour for making frightened people sign things they do not want to sign. He spread the fraudulent property transfer documents across the dining room table and placed a heavy silver pen beside them and began explaining, in the rapid, condescending cadence of a man who mistakes vocabulary for intelligence, that I was signing away my right to exist in my own home. Derek stood at the head of the table, radiating the triumphant energy of a man who believes he has already won. I looked at the papers for a long moment. Then I reached into the inner pocket of my borrowed wool cardigan and removed the thick manila folder Carter Simmons had prepared. I placed it over the transfer documents and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany until it covered every page of their extortion. I told the lawyer to open the folder before he committed career suicide on behalf of his client. The lawyer looked at me. He looked at the folder. The predatory smile flickered. He opened it. The first page was the emergency federal injunction from the Internal Revenue Service, stamped in bright red, dated that morning. The second page was a summary of the dual corporate ledgers and the offshore accounts. The third page was the photographic evidence of the pension embezzlement, names and amounts and routing numbers, the retirement savings of dozens of working-class families systematically drained to pay for a lifestyle built on lies. The lawyer's face went the color of old ash. He did not say a word to Derek. He shoved the documents back into the folder, grabbed his empty briefcase, knocked his chair over backward, getting to his feet, and ran. Not walked, ran. His expensive shoes sliding on the foyer floor, the heavy front door slamming behind him so hard the chandelier swayed. Derek stared at the empty chair. He pulled the manila folder toward him with trembling fingers. He opened it. His eyes moved across the federal injunction seal, the ledger summaries, the photographs of his own hidden safe. All the swagger dissolved out of his body like heat leaving a stone. His knees buckled slightly. He dropped into the nearest chair. He looked up at me with eyes that had finally, fully understood something important. He was completely destroyed, and the understanding drove him, as understanding sometimes drives certain men, not toward surrender but toward violence. Something primitive took over behind his eyes. He stood up so fast his chair crashed backward. He threw himself across the dining room table, arms outstretched, hands reaching for my throat. He believed he was attacking an elderly accountant. He was attacking a 30-year military intelligence operator who had spent decades in rooms with people who actually knew how to fight. I stood. I stepped. I deflected his entire body weight with one forearm, seized his suit jacket with the other hand, used his own momentum against him, and put his face down on the mahogany table with a force that resonated through the entire room. Before he could gather himself, I had his right arm twisted behind his back at an angle that produced immediate, blinding, comprehensive agony, and my left hand pressed firmly at the base of his skull. He stopped moving entirely. He lay there panting against the very documents that condemned him, the federal injunction paper wrinkling under his sweating cheek, completely paralyzed by pain and the absolute collapse of everything he had believed about himself. I leaned down close to his ear. I told him Thomas was safe. I told him my name was Jack. I told him he was completely out of time. And then, outside the silk curtains, the red and blue lights began to paint the walls. Pause. Breathe. I know. I felt every second of this too. The moment Derek understood. The moment 30 years of arrogance and violence and theft met the one thing he had never accounted for. Someone who loved Thomas more than Derek feared consequences. If this story is moving you, please share it. Tell someone who needs to hear that the broken people in our lives are not always as alone as they seem. And keep watching, because what happens to Vivian in Part 5 is the part of this story that took me the longest to make peace with. The federal agents came through the front door like purpose-made physical. The brass lock gave up without ceremony. The heavy-wood swung inward, and they flooded through in a coordinated sweep that was both professional and, to my eyes, deeply satisfying in the way that a mathematical proof is satisfying when the final number lands exactly where it should. I released the pressure on Derek's neck. I stepped back. I raised my hands smoothly to shoulder height to show I was unarmed and cooperative, and I looked directly at the lead agent and stated my full name and my retired military identification number and confirmed that I was the source of the evidence submitted by Carter Simmons. The agent holstered his weapon. He nodded at two officers behind him. They dragged Derek off the mahogany table by the lapels of his ruined suit. He had nothing left. Not the aggression, not the arrogance, not the physical bulk that had always done his arguing for him. He was just a man on his knees in the center of his own dining room, surrounded by evidence of everything he had taken that did not belong to him, weeping in a specific way that has nothing to do with remorse and everything to do with the shock of consequences finally arriving. The handcuffs closed around his wrists with a sound like a door being locked from the outside. The lead agent read the charges. Tax evasion, wire fraud, systematic embezzlement of employee pension funds. And then a local detective stepped forward and added the state charges, felony domestic battery, and elder abuse, based on the injuries sustained by my brother. I had made sure the medical documentation was included in Carter's package. They walked him out through his own front door and put him in the back of a police cruiser, and the neighbors who had watched him perform wealth and status on this street for years stood on their manicured lawns and watched him leave it. Upstairs, Vivian had been screaming. Not the way people scream in grief or fear, but the way people scream when something they believed was permanent turns out to be conditional. I could hear her through the ceiling, the high, disbelieving sound of a woman watching her illusions being disassembled from the outside. She came down the stairs when the front door was breached, and she stood in the foyer staring through the windows at the vehicles on her lawn and the uniforms on her steps, and she looked like someone who had opened a beautiful gift box and found it full of exactly what she deserved. When the agents cleared the ground floor and the immediate legal business was completed, I found her in the dining room. She turned to face me, and the shock cracked open into something ugly and desperate. She pointed at me and began to scream. She told me I had ruined her marriage, her social standing, her life. She commanded me to call the bank and wire my brother's entire portfolio to a bail bondsman to get her husband out of jail. I let her scream until she was hoarse. The sound of it did not bring me any satisfaction. I want to be honest about that. There was no joy in watching Vivian Hartwell disintegrate in the center of the dining room, where her father had eaten cold toast alone for 6 months. There was only a deep, aching sadness for the woman she might have been. The daughter Thomas had believed in and driven to school and paid for and wept for and carried into adulthood with such tremendous love. That woman had made a series of choices, and those choices had brought us here. I reached into my cardigan and placed the photocopied credit card statements on the table in front of her without a word. She looked down at them. She saw the $82,000 of accumulated debt in its complete detail, every designer handbag, every mountain spa retreat, every item she had swiped a platinum card for while her father slept on a rustic cot in the room beneath her feet. She asked me in a hollow, fractured whisper how I had gotten those. I told her the corporate funds were frozen and would be seized entirely to repay the stolen pensions. I told her the blind trust protecting Thomas's assets was legally sealed and impenetrable. I told her Thomas was never going to pay for a single pair of her shoes ever again. She began to hyperventilate. She clutched the edge of the table. And then, in a voice that cracked and broke and barely held itself together, she called me Dad. She said the word she had not used in the presence of her actual father in longer than I could calculate. She said it to me, to a retired military investigator wearing her father's cardigan and reading glasses, because there was no one else left in the room to say it to. She begged for a second chance and wept real tears, the first real ones I had seen from her, and they were entirely for herself. I thought about Thomas on the concrete floor of the basement. I thought about the butterfly bandages, the cold toast, the moment she turned her back and walked upstairs. I looked at her and told her she had lost the right to ask for my help the exact moment she made that choice. I told her silence was a decision. I told her she was paying the bill for hers. I gave her 1 hour to pack a single suitcase and leave. She ran up the stairs, and I stood in the quiet dining room alone, and I listened to the frantic sound of her tearing through her closets, trying to stuff her luxury wardrobe into a single piece of luggage, and I drank a glass of water and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into my bones. 60 minutes later, the door closed behind her. The house was clean. Tell me in the comments. And if you have dealt with something similar, share your story. You are not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. 7 days later, I drove my restored vintage truck down the winding road toward Maplewood Veterans Retreat on a morning so clear and crisp it felt like the world had been rinsed overnight. Thomas was waiting for me outside the glass doors when I pulled into the circular drive. I almost did not recognize him. Not because he looked different from when I had first seen him on that bench 7 days ago, but because he looked like himself again, the himself that had existed before Derek Hartwell, before the basement, before the butterfly bandages, before 6 months of slow, systematic destruction had compressed him into something small and afraid. He stood straight. His shoulders were back. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and moved with the quiet, assured dignity of a man who had remembered who he was. The dark bruising around his eye had faded to a faint yellowish shadow. His ribs had begun to heal. He had slept without fear for 7 nights. He saw me leaning against the truck, and his face did something it had not done in the courtyard a week ago. It smiled. Not the careful, manufactured smile of a man performing normalcy, but a real one, the kind that starts in the chest and moves upward and reaches all the way to the eyes and stays there. He walked down the path with steady steps and took my hand in both of his. We drove back to the estate in the kind of silence that only exists between people who have known each other their entire lives and have no need to fill the air between them. Thomas looked out the window at the autumn landscape, the last gold leaves holding on against the gray sky, and I drove and listened to the engine and felt something that had been missing for a long time finally settle back into place. When we pulled into the driveway, and he unlocked his own front door with his own key and stepped over his own threshold, he stopped for a moment in the foyer and simply stood there. He ran his hand along the wall. He looked up at the chandelier. He walked into the dining room and touched the polished surface of the mahogany table where the monster had finally been brought down. Then he walked into the living room and sat in the leather armchair, his armchair, the one Derek had occupied during all those nights of drinking and threatening and performing dominance, and he sat in it like a man who has come home after a very long absence and cannot quite believe the door was still unlocked. I found the crystal decanter in the back of the mahogany cabinet where Thomas had always kept it hidden, and I poured 2 glasses of aged bourbon, and I carried them back into the living room, and we raised them in silence, and we drank. We did not speak about Derek, who was sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting a trial that would almost certainly send him away for decades. We did not speak about Vivian, who was somewhere in the city confronting the wreckage of a life built on borrowed money and other people's suffering. We talked about fishing, about rebuilding the wooden deck in the backyard before winter arrived. Thomas mentioned a stretch of coastline he had always meant to visit with Eleanor, and his voice went soft for a moment, and I let it go soft, and we both sat with that softness for a while. The sunlight came through the large windows and lay across the floor in long, warm rectangles, and the house was quiet in the way that houses become quiet when they have been returned to the people who belong in them. I thought about what the whole experience had taught me, Not in the tactical sense, not about lockpicking or financial forensics or psychological warfare, but in the deeper sense, the human sense. My brother had endured 6 months of sustained abuse and manipulation because he believed that the biological fact of parenthood created an obligation that superseded his own safety. He told himself that because Vivian was his daughter, he owed her his silence and his submission and ultimately his entire financial existence. He mistook the fact of being related for the experience of being loved. True family is not a biological designation. It is a daily choice. It is the decision made over and over to protect rather than exploit, to show up rather than walk away, to sit on a wooden bench with someone who is breaking and refuse to leave until the truth comes out. The people who make that choice for you are your family. The people who make the other choice have made it freely, and they carry the consequences of it freely. And all the silk robes and designer handbags in the world cannot purchase back what is lost when someone decides that another person's suffering is simply the acceptable price of their own comfort. You are allowed to sever those ties. You're not only allowed. Sometimes it is the most loving thing left to do. Not for them. For the Thomas in your life. For the person sitting on the bench in the cold with broken butterfly bandages and trembling hands, who came to say goodbye because they believed no one was coming. Someone is always coming. Sometimes they are sitting right next to you, wearing the same face. Thomas fell asleep in his armchair that afternoon with the bourbon glass still in his hand and the sunlight moving slowly across the floor, and I sat across from him and watched him sleep without fear for the first time in half a year. And the house was so quiet and so clean and so completely his. If this story reaches something in you, please like and share it. And if you have ever had to make the painful choice to protect yourself from someone who was supposed to love you, tell me in the comments. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground, reclaiming what is yours, and choosing the people who choose you.